Thank you, Laurence. That's been a very kind introduction. Many lies, but of course nice lies that I'll hear with pleasure. And the way you've introduced this and you've set this up echoes what I was meaning to say in the opening paragraphs. I will repeat them more or less because they are in a different language, but I think I'm exactly sort of starting where you ended. The Centenary is the starting point. A century ago, the First World War was coming to an end. Allied forces were moving towards the Hindenburg Line in the west of Germany, well, in France, but considered to be the protective last line of defense for Germany. British forces were liberating Damascus, were moving onto Mosul in what is nowadays Iraq. Germany, Austria, Turkey were all in different stages of putting feelers out for armistice negotiations. Bulgaria had already left the coalition and had already sued for peace. And in November, as you say, in early November 1918, the war was over on Armistice Day. Now, in parallel to these developments on the battlefield, planning for the post-war peace was picking up. And the contours of what might come afterwards were taking shape. The British cabinet was discussing the Phillimore report, more or less exactly a century ago, a preparatory report outlining plans for a future organization or future world organization. In France, the Association Française pour la Société des Nations was set up in November 1918. The South African general, Jan Smuts, published a pamphlet just before Christmas, but probably at these weeks wrote in it a pamphlet entitled The League of Nations, A Practical Suggestion, and that was considered by most at the time as the most influential pamphlet outlining the course towards, a practical course towards a League of Nations association. And then it went really quite fast. At the Paris Peace Conference in early 1919, the covenant of the League of Nations was agreed pretty much before the difficult questions relating to the Versailles Treaty, the treaties of Sèvres, Neuilly, and Saint-Germain were tackled. It took 11 days, I think, of serious sessions to work out the covenant. It was revolution in record time. That covenant, the covenant of the League of Nations, la Pacte de la Société des Nations, entered into force on 10th January 1920. And 6 days later, now this is not quite a century ago now, but in early 1920, Léon Bourgeois, French statesman, protagonist of the Hague Peace Conferences, former Prime Minister, opened the first session of the Council of the League of Nations. And he said this on 16th of January. He said, la date du 16 janvier 1920 sera inscrite dans l'histoire comme celle de la naissance d'un monde nouveau. A new world was being set up. And why that? Because les nations libres, pour la première fois, se seront liguées pour substituer au règne de la force l'empire du droit. And in that short phrase, it's all in it. You have it all. Right versus might, hope and optimism, potential for hubris and downfall, drama, high hopes, and pomp and circumstance. This is where it came from. This is a different take, a different version of the same take. This is Paul Nash, British writer, whose painting is entitled We Are Making the New World. The impulse was very clear. This was a new world made on the graveyard of the old. This is depicting the battlefields of Western Europe. It was high time for a new world. Now, quite apart from the grand lines, the grand words, my rather more mundane reference to the dates suggests that we're really now in centenary territory. For the next 2 years, we can probably, with some justification, have conferences on the League of Nations 100 years ago. And I hope I'm a little ahead of the curve, speaking to you about the League of Nations a little before the centenaries can be celebrated with real justification, but perhaps I can fortify you or fortify us for what is ahead in the next 2 years of centenary, no doubt, repetitions and centenary celebrations. Now, a final preliminary remark. There's a certain danger, which I became aware of after having agreed to give this talk, that there's a certain danger in flying from Glasgow to Geneva to speak about the League of Nations. I don't think I've, in my life, ever come as close to carrying oals to Athens, but and sort of I'm slightly apprehensive that in in the audience are many people who know a lot more about the details, certainly, and about the League of Nations generally than I do. But perhaps my avoidance technique is understandable, given that rather than offering you detail and nuance, I'll probably be fairly lofty and offering a general overview, which hopefully will set the stage for future more detailed discussions. And the focus will be on legacies of the League, at least in the second half of this talk. What is it that is worth remembering about the League? In what respects does it deserve our continued interest a century on? And that will be in the form of, let's say, relatively general reflection on key themes rather than nuance and detail. Now, before going to the legacies, I feel I should say at least a word about the Covenant and the League's experience. This will be relatively eclectic because we don't have sort of 3 years, but only an hour, I was told, or 50 minutes. And I will condense this into 3 snapshots, really. The League in 3 snapshots. The first is a snapshot view of the Covenant as the founding document of the League of Nations. The next snapshot, and I'm picking up on themes mentioned by Laurence in her introduction, will be on the League of Nations as a collective security institution. And the third snapshot will be on the League of Nations as an institution that did a lot more than engage with collective security in a narrow sense. So that's the plan for the first half of the talk. And let me begin by saying a word about the Covenant, a document which, at least in English, has a very pretentious title. But a pretentious title, Covenant, which was chosen, well, not only consciously, but perhaps also ostensibly with some justification. Because the League institutionally was something new. For centuries, men and occasionally women had dreamed up and drawn up plans for a world organization, ensuring world peace. Tennyson has a famous phrase, speaking of parliaments of men and federations of the world, where the war drum throbs no longer and the battle flags are furled. It's been an age-old dream, but it was never close to realization. The 19th century had seen informal arrangements such as the Council of Europe, looking at managing peace in a regional setting. And it had seen more formal associations of international organizations, international administrative unions, looking at technical and administrative matters, telegraph, postal unions, etc. But it took a world war and really sort of the experience that Nash depicted in the painting to put the 2 strands together and to merge the Council of Europe logic with the International Administrative Union logic and to set up one world organization. And that move, a relatively momentous step, in retrospect, was taken surprisingly swiftly. As I said, it was really a matter of a few sessions to work out the details of the Covenant. And I think 3 things stand out about this Covenant. I'm somewhat apprehensive to say this in the presence of Robert Kolb, who's written a whole commentary or edited a whole commentary on the commentary, which is worth your perusal and which, of course, goes well beyond 3 quick facts about the Covenant that I will be giving you. But maybe for the introductory seminar on the 2-year centenary celebrations, that's a start. So first, the Covenant. The first aspect of the Covenant was that it was an organizational statute. The Covenant set up organs through which the League would act. A plenary forum, the assembly, where all members had a place, a smaller representative body named the Council, the terms are familiar, where some influential powers would have their seats, some of them permanently, others elected for 3-year periods at the time. Council and Assembly would be aided by a secretariat of League officials, and the core League that was described by these 3 institutions was to integrate pre-existing international organizations, the administrative unions that existed previously and were meant to integrate them in a League system, if you want. Now, the same could be said with a bit of delay about an international court that wasn't quite created in 1920, but was created in 1922, 1923, if you want, an appendix to the reformative drive of the post-World War order, the Permanent Court of International Justice, which was not nominally integrated in the League of Nations, but as international lawyers would tend to make too much of that because functionally it was very close and linked to the League of Nations in manifold ways. So the Covenant set up an institutional system built around functions of governance, we might say. It was certainly not setting up a state or any world government, but it created institutions that would deal with governmental functions. Parliamentary functions, representation, administration, executive action, adjudication. These were all in one way or the other reflected now on the international sphere under one institutional roof. The Covenant, and this is my second point, or my second and third points, also formulated the aims of the League. It did so in a relatively austere preamble that tasked the Covenant to to pursue two aims. And I'm quoting from the preamble, which said the League should promote international cooperation and achieve international peace and security. Relatively austere if we compare it to the preamble of the Charter. No scourges of war in the League Covenant. They were very present, but they didn't translate into preambular language. The language was far more toned down. Now, the preamble was getting it wrong if we're looking at the order. It spoke about international cooperation first and achieving international peace second. But if we're looking at the Covenant as a whole, it was clear that the order of significance was reversed. The Covenant as a whole really primarily was about setting up a mechanism that would help ensure international peace. And that was obvious given the background. I mean, Bourgeois' New World wasn't new because it would somewhat have slightly more significant international cooperation, but it was meant to be new and new in a revolutionary sense because it would succeed, thought Bourgeois, to abolish war and ensure peace. So that was the central impetus, and it's very clear again from the painting of Nash that you may still remember that this was the driver for institutional change. As always, it would be interesting to do a sort of a percentage breakdown, how many institutional momentous changes are the result of lessons from war. This one certainly was. Now the Covenant mostly was then about peace and security. A few sound bites, no more. Articles 8 and 9 spoke about disarmament obligations or an encouragement to disarm. Articles 10 to 16, in many ways the core, if you want a rudimentary version of what today is Chapter 7 in the UN Charter, set up a system of collective security based on a solidarity vision, as Article 11 said it, that any war or threat of war was a matter of concern to the whole League. League members were to bring before the organs of the League, and in particular the Council, or to submit to peaceful dispute resolution all crises that were likely to lead to a rupture, as Article 15 put it. And there was no equivalent in the Covenant, importantly, to the UN Charter's comprehensive ban on military force, but the Covenant made strides towards sectoral outlawry of force or war by prohibiting recourse to war during cooling off periods while dispute settlement was underway and when conflicts had been brought before the League organs. So, in essence, the Covenant tried and I think succeeded to establish what Philip Jessup would later call a peace machinery, an institutional arrangement that was meant to ensure peace. Final point on the Covenant was more than, or the League was more than a peace institution though. That was the driver, but not the only point. And this is my third remark on the Covenant. It did envisage cooperation in other fields as well. But the language that it used to speak about matters beyond security, if you want, was much more haphazard, tentative, optional. It mentioned a few aims. For example, freedom of commerce and transit should be guaranteed. The suppression of the drug trade and slavery should be goals that the League of Nations would pursue. Disease control, minority protection, the well-being of inhabitants in the so-called mandate territories, of which perhaps I'll say a bit more in a minute. So there were references, signposts, if you want, of what the League might do, but the language was much less specific. It was partly hortatory, partly aspirational, partly encouraging. And we see this, we know this at least as sort of students of UN law, of course, from the UN Charter as well. The UN Charter is not the same by any stretch as the Covenant, but in this respect it is very much the same. It has relatively clear guidance on questions of peace and security, has next to no guidance on questions of human rights law, development. These are signposted, but on the basis of a textual analysis of 1945, who would have known that human rights would matter significantly in the UN practice? And we can say the same point about the Covenant and the League. So here we go on this first point. A document with an impressive name, Covenant, that set up an institutional arrangement and a machinery for peace, and then encouraged or hinted at potential work in fields not directly related to peace and security, narrowly construed. That, I would suggest, is the normative baseline from which things started to unfold in 1920 when the Covenant entered into force, and that concludes my first snapshot. Moving on then and picking up pace a bit. How did things unfold from 1920 onwards? What happened? How did that living tree, if you want, grow? I'll be organizing this in a relatively simplistic way about the two themes I've hinted at. Peace and security on the one hand, and activities beyond peace and security narrowly construed on the other. That is a relatively schematic distinction, which you can revisit as the 2-year celebrations continue. But maybe for the start, it's okay. It'll certainly help us structure the discussion. So peace and security, collective security first. What was this peace machinery of the Covenant, and how did it fare in practice? Did it achieve international peace, as the preamble said? Well, I'm probably not giving away much if I say that in the end the Covenant and the League failed to achieve international peace. Born from one great war, it ended up standing on the sidelines as the next and greater war broke out. By the late 1930s, the League had lost all credibility as a peace and security actor, and it was hapless and hopeless. And that theme, of course, dominates our perception of the League up to this day. Mention the League, and most people will think of failures. Google League of Nations, and words like Abyssinia, crisis, failure, demise show up. The dominant narrative is that of decline and fall of an ambitious institution that started boldly and ended poorly. And we see it reflected in everyday discourse, where the UN fails to be effective, or as effective as commentators would want. Commentators warn that the UN must not become a second league. It must do better. Asterix, to lighten the mood somewhat, knew it too. I mean, it's not just sort of commentator. This is from Asterix chez les Helvètes. Asterix, as you may know better than I do, visits Geneva or something resembling Geneva, and then enters a tribal assembly or an assembly of tribal leaders, and they're blending in because they need to hide from the Romans. And what do the tribal leaders do there? They sit and talk and talk and talk and talk. And the best way of blending in, Obelix is told, is to fall asleep, because that's what one does. So a talking shop, if you want, but devoid of any power of effective action. So that's the abiding theme. Now, I'm not going to stand out to correct that theme. There's truth to that. Maybe just sort of by way of nuancing or consolation goals, if you want football analogies. Things hadn't started that badly. The early years of the League were also marked by some successes. Successful mediation in the Orlan conflict between Finland and Sweden, with results up to this day. Successful mediation in Greek-Bulgarian border disputes, relatively effective. Successful involvement or relatively decisive action in Turkish-British struggles over Mosul. Should this be Iraq and British mandate, or should this be Turkey? Well, it ended up being British, and today, up to this day, remains Iraqi territory. I'm not sure this was good, but it was certainly decisive what the League did. So it did have some successes, and I think people writing in 1927 with some credibility could look to the League of Nations as a relevant new actor on the international scene that had some successes in conflict resolution. And I think it's important to mention that, because the risk is that we're looking at it only from our perspective and only see the failures. But of course, it's banal to say that the failures are also part of the pictures, and from the late 1920s onwards, they dominate the overall impression. So, faced with economic crises at home, governments from the late 1920s onwards were far less willing to engage internationally and to throw their support behind the League. In Germany and elsewhere, Italy, fascist movements derided, from a German perspective, the hated Versailles Order and associated the League with it. The Geneva Disarmament Conference of the early 30s failed, and most importantly, during the big crises of the League of the 1930s, the League proved itself ineffective. Lord Robert Cecil is one of the most ardent supporters of the League, a sort of a British politician who coined this phrase of the Great Experiment that I chose as the title for the League era. Now, in his book, which also has that title, A Great Experiment, the chapter covering the 1930s has a one-word title. The title is Downhill, and it went downhill. Now, in that journey downhill, two crises stand out, Manchuria and Abyssinia. Both demonstrated how much the League as an institution depended on the actual and continuing and ongoing political will of its members, how little it could do as such and on its own, and how little it could do if that will was lacking. So in 1931, the League established a commission of inquiry that documented Japan's aggressive policies in Manchuria, but it couldn't agree to follow through sanctions procedures that were possible under the Covenant. There was no political will towards that. When Italy invaded Abyssinia 4 years later, the League did impose sanctions, but they were half-hearted, and the League's failure and embarrassment was plain to all in Geneva when the Abyssinian or Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie addressed the Assembly in 1936, pleaded for international help. The Assembly listened, but it led the Emperor being shouted down by Italian journalists sitting in the audience, and a South African representative who witnessed all this said this: 50 nations, led by the most powerful in the world, had declared their powerlessness to protect the weakest in their midst. So the Abyssinia crisis was the League's darkest hour. That was the League's Rwanda moment, if you want. But unlike in the UN, there was no bouncing back. There was no Kofi Annan impulse to rectify things afterwards. There was no reversal of that. And so in the crises of the late 1930s, the League ceased to be relevant. Its attempts to intervene in the Spanish Civil War were leading nowhere. This cartoon depicts the grave of the League after the Munich Pact of 1938. And by 1939, the League had lost all credibility and did not even discuss the outbreak of World War II. Not even words. So as an attempt to achieve international peace and security, the Great Experiment begun in 1919 had effectively failed 20 years later. So what did go wrong? The easy answer is that the League was deserted by its members. In the way that sometimes these days the member states are accused of letting down the UN in Syria and South Sudan or elsewhere or everywhere. And there's some truth to that. The League couldn't act without its members. It has no autonomous power. So it depended on the commitment, the willingness to activate the existing collective security mechanism. But at no point did it have the support of all states, and from the 30s onwards it had the support of very few or no states. So yes, the easy answer is partly true. The League's failure is partly a failure of states to make collective security within the League work. But the easy answer is also at the same time too easy. It's always what is said. You can always point fingers. But I think there's also an element of realization that in the crises of the 1930s, what was thrown into stark relief was not just lack of political will, but also an ill-designed collective security system. Collective security under the Covenant was essentially a matter of process, of cooling off periods, of submitting to dispute resolution, of involving an international organ or dispute resolution. And the Covenant was what Ines Claude in his book on international organizations calls the product of a retrospective mentality. So the Covenant sought and might have succeeded in stopping states from sleepwalking into a war, in the way the nations sleepwalked or are seen to have sleepwalked into the First World War. Maybe in July 1914, a cooling off period would have done wonders and would have allowed Austrian and German emperors and Russian tsars to come to their senses. But that didn't work in the crises of the 1930s. The retrospective mentality is understandable, and we can say, well, look, you know where you're coming from, but it didn't prove of any help when nations were no longer in the mood of sleepwalking into war, but plotting for it. And again, Ines Claude, from the same book, Swords into Plowshares, says this, and I think hits the nail on the head. The League, established to prevent the accidental war, was unable to cope with Hitler's deliberately plotted campaign of conquest. So the drafters of the covenant had studied the past, but shown insufficient imagination in anticipating how future conflicts might unfold. At Dumbarton Oaks and in San Francisco in the 40s, the drafters of the UN sought to redress that, and they did change course to some extent, but of course they wrote a charter that again was the product of a retrospective mentality, a charter that was built on great power alliance and that would have functioned perfectly in a new Second World War, but maybe wasn't quite adept to dealing with future conflicts, which from the perspective of 1945 would be the future conflicts. So I don't think the drafters of the charter escaped the criticism, but they did correct some of the mistakes that the League drafters made. So, to conclude on the second snapshot, peace and security with justification is seen as a massive failure of the League, notwithstanding early successes. From the 1930s onwards, for a range of reasons, some of which I've sketched out, this was indeed downhill, a steep journey downhill. Now, the third snapshot is somewhat more uplifting. So for the purpose of this third snapshot, I will quickly speak about the League's activities beyond peace and security. To reiterate, these were hinted at in the covenant, not really spelled out in any detail. These weren't at the forefront of the drafters, or these weren't the motivation for setting up the League, but they played a role. So compared to that background, I think it's fair to say that on that second, perhaps lesser task, aim, the League was a tremendous success. By 1945, when the League was wound up and sort of terminated, international corporations in fields beyond peace and security had been transformed. Pre-existing arrangements were gradually integrated into the League system, as the Covenant had wanted it, but the key change was an expansion of international corporations into new fields under the aegis of the League. The League's activities over the course of its 20-25 years really sort of mushroomed. The League branched out, often beginning with ad hoc responses to crises on the ground, typhus in Poland in the 1920s, Austria's near bankruptcy in the early 1920s, Hungary's financial chaos during the same period. So the League would act on an ad hoc basis, but over time, ad hoc arrangements would be transformed into permanent structures. So in fields such as economic and financial cooperation, in health, in relation to the mandates, where there was more of an institutional backing to start with, in the field of refugee protection, in the field of legal codification, of uniformization of laws, in the fields such as we would probably today say crime prevention, drug trafficking, white slavery. Often ad hoc arrangements were the starting point, and they were translated into more permanent structures. Now, much of this was pretty pedestrian. Data collection, compiling files, reporting systems, regularizing reporting, seeking information, bringing nations together to coordinate. Not all of this was super exciting, but in some of the episodes in this cooperation beyond peace and security, the League appears rather differently than in the orthodox accounts that's premised on decline and fall. So the League did save Austria from bankruptcy. It did stabilize Hungary's finances in the 1920s. And it did so through a mix of loans and generous coming together, but also harsh austerity measures of the sort that international institutions have, let's say, brought them upon states these days as well. The League wasn't that much different. Not saying it should endear us to it, but it should maybe move us away from the idea that this was always a hapless paper tiger. In the field of refugee protection, the League organized ad hoc responses first and then introduced a relatively clever system of protection organized around a key document, the so-called Nansen passports. Not passports in the proper sense, but entitlements to stay in a certain country that was not your country of origin. By the early 30s, 500,000 of such Nansen passports had been handed out. Onassis had one, Rachmaninov had one. I don't think they would have looked to the League as a paper tiger. They would probably quite happy that the League did this. And the examples could be multiplied. Global health governance of the sort we know it today is probably unthinkable. I mean, I stand to be corrected, but it's unthinkable without the League's efforts at setting up structures for disease prevention, data collection, research cooperation. Minority protection can be seen as an early precursor of something that would explode in the 1950s and 60s human rights agendas, because it shared a common impulse that states would be obliged to recognize rights of peoples living within their territories and would be under some form of monitoring or supervision whether they observe these rights. Now, I don't want to oversell the point. As I said, much of this was pedestrian. Much of this was coordinative, not intrusive. Much of the work of the League in these fields, social, economic, cultural, technical, humanitarian cooperation, saw the League not really act as the valiant, powerful savior who intervenes against evil states, but as the expert sitting in the back, or the coordinator, or the facilitator. So, to some extent, this was belittled throughout the League's time and continues, of course, to be belittled to this day. But it was highly effective from the parameters defined in the 1920s. And I think the key point then is this for this third snapshot. Where the Covenant had been tentative and sketchy, the League moved fairly decisively. It occupied fields that, from the perspective of 1914 or 1900 or even 1918, were well beyond the remit of international cooperation. And they branched out. The League branched out. It filled the Covenant with life when it comes to these other provisions. And by the 1930s, these other fields of activity occupied 2/3 of the League's budget. And you saw the center of gravity shifting towards that. So Joseph Avenot, the second Secretary General of the League of Nations, was engaged in a relatively ambitious attempt to centralize all these mushrooming activities and bring them back under central command control, if you want. And of course, the institutions that had been set up sort of insisted on their autonomy and insisted that they wouldn't be centralized quite so much. There's also a further perspective. If we're looking at a commentary on the League, then we see that from the late 1930s onwards, we have in the work of Mitrani and others an attempt to break down that simple binary divide which I'm using here between peace and security and the rest. And under the notion of studying functional cooperation, we're looking at spillovers, at linkages, and not accepting that cooperation in cultural, social, and economic field was of any lesser relevance. So we see a concerted engagement from within the League, from commentators, with these fields that the Covenant had treated so briefly. And I think it culminates from within the League's perspective in the late 1930s, which was probably the most significant attempt at League reform. The Bruce Report, set up in the late 1930s, if you want an early day equivalent to high-level panel reports or so of the UN era, in which precisely a focus on social and economic questions was advocated. These were meant to be upgraded and were meant to be given an institutional status similar to the peace and security questions. So the League did take that on board. And I would say generally, I mean, while the League was not able to implement the Bruce Report, its experience over the 2 decades of its active involvement shows a massive expansion into fields that the Covenant had merely hinted at. So this is where we stand. I mean, admittedly schematic as an overview. A world organization based on a covenant that is an institutional structure, a peace machinery that struggles to cope from the 1930s onwards with real crisis, and an institution that occupies ever greater fields and ever broader fields in the horizontal broadening of international institutional work with international institutional law. I think this is sketchy and schematic, I would be the first to admit, but hopefully a basis for what I would hope to do in the next 20, 25 minutes in the last third, let's say, of this talk, namely to assess legacies and see what of this remains relevant. You might say it's historically relevant or not, or interesting or not, and maybe we should be able to have sort of a first level knowledge, because this is what people will be writing newspaper articles around in the next few years and all this, and maybe it's generally not so bad to have some sort of basic pub quiz level of knowledge about things past. But is there any current relevance to this? Is there any current significance to these beyond the historical, nostalgic reminiscing. That's the plan for the last third. And as I said at the beginning, I'm trying to do three things. I'm trying to sort of have you look at this or look with me or follow me in looking at this from three angles. One is the legacy of the League as a landmark in international organization. That's the first perspective. The second is, because this is a law class after all, the legacy of the League in the field more particularly defined of international law. And the third is stepping back, but I think I'll probably have to be a bit brief because I'm as expensive in my speaking as the League was in occupying the territories of technical cooperation. Maybe a perspective on the League and internationalism as a mindset. Maybe that as a parting shot, if you want. So first of all, then, the League and international organization. Oops. Here we go. In this respect, I think the legacy of the League is obvious. For better or worse, I think in our thinking about international organizations, at least on the universal scale, we are stuck with concepts, notions, and recipes that were tried out in the League era. And were first tried out in the League era. Often we're aware of this, but sometimes we tend to overlook it because it's become so obvious that this is how international organization work that we tend to neglect how formative and shaping the League experience was. So let me try to raise some awareness by mentioning a few points that we usually take for granted without mentioning them. Now, if we step back from the failures and successes of the League in particular areas, then I think we can see in the League, for better or worse, a template or a blueprint for international organizations. And one that a century onwards we haven't really overcome. Now, it may perhaps appear counterintuitive, because of course the League was a failure, and if you took the perspective of 1945, nothing would have been more alien to commentators at the time than to see the League as a successful model that was meant to be replicated. There's a wonderful episode in a wonderful book, which if I had it with me, I would hold up here now, Frank Moorhouse's Edith trilogy, a series of 3 books about an Australian woman, Edith, who in the first 2 volumes works in the League of Nations and lives through the League's optimistic and less optimistic periods, and then in the third volume moves back to Australia and engages in Australian politics. But in the second of these volumes, Dark Days, I'm forgetting now, Dark Palace, she witnesses the winding up of the League in Geneva, how it's reduced to skeleton staff, and then it's the core League staff that is sent over to San Francisco for the founding conference of the UN. And they go there with some expectation. They're the experts after all. They've been doing international organization for 25 years. They expect to be consulted. They see themselves as the older brothers or sisters who are willing and generous to give advice. But of course, there's a certain pretension in that. And what they're not prepared for is that nobody cares for them. They are toxic. They are the losers. They are the ones who failed. They have a stigma. So it's really wonderfully captured in that book. It's worth reading the books generally, but that episode is particularly striking. So Sean Lester, the last acting secretary of the League of Nations, goes to San Francisco, expects to give something like a keynote or sort of an endorsement to the new second incarnation, if you want, of the project. And instead, he hardly gets tickets for the audience. He's relegated to the cheap places at the back because who is he? He personifies the failure of the project. So what is needed is a break, a rupture. So against that background, it may be a bit counterintuitive to say the League's model or blueprint or template was a success, but I do think it is. And if we step back a bit from the immediate rupture or break point of sort of 1945, we see it quite clearly, and I think we see it more clearly if we're moving beyond the cheap decline and fall narratives that just see the League in this perspective. So 3 continuities, or 3 ways in which the League continues to shape our thinking about international organization. The first is structural continuity, or if you want, continuity in structure. The League was the first to marry peace and security and social, economic, cultural, humanitarian cooperation under one roof. They had previously been separated out into different institutions or organizations, the League was the first to have an umbrella concept to international organization. With states as central units, so nothing approaching world government, but with a huge comprehensive mandate. Now, it seems pretty clear that, at least if we're thinking about global governance projects, this remains the template. Of course, we have specialized actors, but it's been repeated at the UN, it's repeated in the OSCE, even where sectors where international organizations start more narrowly defined, they tend to branch out. So I think in that respect, it's a very obvious continuity. If you're moving one step back towards a more operational level, then I think the League's institutional structures have been copied frequently, and of course, most obviously in the UN. It goes down to the names. We have a council and an assembly, just as it was in the League. There's a secretariat, which is given short shrift in the founding documents and in reality quite significant. Where mandates existed, the UN set up a trusteeship council. Where a court existed sort of on the sidelines of the League structure, the UN has integrated that court. Taking on board the Bruce reform, the UN has integrated social and economic reforms in the ECOSOC Council. But of course, the UN, just like the League, struggles with coherence. It struggles with coherence just as other, and I'm pretty sure that many UN Secretary Generals have dreamed the dream of Avenol of reining in all these autonomous specialized agencies. So it's the same organizational structure, the same challenges. The League remains the template. Secondly, the aims. Now, as I've said, the first organization with a comprehensive mandate bridging a previous divide, it was an innovation in 1919. Now, since 1919, the meaning of peace and security, of cooperation in the humanitarian fields, the emphasis we give to certain fields within those aims has shifted and changed. But I do think we can easily find continuities. So institutionalized collective security, which began with the League, ill-designed as it may have been, remains our preferred method of dealing with peace and security. A council remains at the heart of peace and security schemes, not courts, for example, which in the 19th century pipe dreams of international organization, or even at the Hague Peace Conferences, were central actors, guardians of peace. Courts are safely somewhere on the sidelines, useful but not significant. I mean, perhaps significant occasionally, but not systemically relevant at the heart of the project. The peace project, pursued through international organizations, remains one of collective decision-making, where multilateral decision-making processes give legitimacy, and the decision is a political one. Law isn't out of that, but it's not a legalized process. And if we adopt that perspective, then I think we clearly see 1919 as the significant breakthrough in which a notion of collective security was imposed upon the world or sprung upon the world. And that notion of collective security, however it is defined in the operational provisions of Chapter 7 or old Article 11 of the Covenant, that broad vision remains the same. And I would make a similar point for the vast field of international cooperation in the social, economic, cultural, humanitarian fields. Like the Charter, like the Covenant, so the Charter doesn't really reflect their relevance, but as in the League, so in the UN, in practice, they dominate. Now again, this can be easily dismissed. An organization that fails in maintaining peace in major conflicts fiddles around with a bit of reporting here and fine-tunes data collection and comes up with ever greater detail in organizing reporting procedures. But of course that's cheap. I mean, it's not without justification, but it's also cheap because it ignores the function that cooperation in these fields plays. And I think it ignores, which is more important for my point, that the UN, whether this is good or bad, pursues the League's path of branching out, of greater density of regulation in fields of social, economic, and technical cooperation, and of focusing on this, and of making this an emphasis in practice, whatever the Charter says. So if incoming Secretary Generals say, as they all do, that they want to make development the core activity of the UN Charter, then I think there are adept disciples of Drummond and his predecessors in the League of Nations who did just that. not with development as a notion, but with a shift away from the activities which were at the forefront of the texts that they were given to work with. A final point, much briefer. Again, on the League as an international organization. Now, not focusing on the institutions, nor the aims or tasks, but the people. As I said, or I hope I've said, I may have sort of skipped that, the League was the first international organization to work with a truly international civil service. It employed civil servants as in international organizations. These weren't seconded to the League by governments or lent out, or these weren't sort of ad hoc arrangements. The League was an employer. That was a first in 1919, 1920. And given my background, I would never miss out to say that a Scot, or more perhaps precisely a British civil servant with Scottish ancestry, Sir Eric Drummond, is credited with having taken that decision. The first Secretary General of the League was said to have insisted on the idea of an international civil service against opposition, where governments wanted to continue as before, with sort of national civil servants who would just be in Geneva. And Drummond said, no, we need an international civil service. It's another quiet revolution in international organization that began in 1920, and we take it for granted today because it's so obvious that international organizations will have their own personnel. Now, where would we be without that? The League had a few thousand employees in its heyday. The UN now, I don't know, I haven't looked at the latest figures, but probably is approaching 200,000 or so it's massively grown. But the key point, the structural decision remains the same. The League would need its own international civil service. It would need employees with loyalty, with expertise. And there would, of course, be a tension with the divided loyalties of these civil servants between their home countries and their international organization. But we would move to the stage where there is a tension because they are employed by the international organization. And again, that is a given today. It started with the League. So to step back from this for the first legacy, if you want, by the 1940s, the League had become toxic. There had to be a break, it had to be dissolved, and you couldn't be seen with League officials. But all later efforts at international organization have remained premised on the League template. I would emphasize that point. A template that has been adapted, of course, changed, twisted, modified, but not replaced, and perhaps improved, but not replaced. I think it's the working template for all attempts at international organization. Mark Mazawa puts it in another good book, Governing the World, The History of an Idea. He speaks of the flexible model of international government that the League created that would not only survive the Second World War, but would be greatly expanded and refined. So however we rate the League as a failure or success or somewhere in the middle, there's a strong case for focusing, and this is again Mazawa's term, on the League's enduring influence on our understanding of international organization, and that concludes my first legacy. I think that is probably the key legacy of the League, its formative influence on our understanding of international organization. More briefly, a second one, but perhaps closer to home for those of you who are law students and who might wonder that where's the law in this talk? So if you're good doctrinal French-trained lawyers, here you go. Well, not quite. I don't think you'll be quite happy with what I say. It'll remain lofty, but at least the object of my lofty reflection is now the law, le droit. Again, a legacy for the League of Nations in its dealing with international law. Now, it's a slightly different type of reflection now, because the League didn't dominate international law in the way that the League dominated the thinking about international organization. There was a wealth of international law existing during the League period which had nothing to do with the League. States continued to conclude treaties, there was custom, there were disputes. The League wasn't involved in everything, by no means. So international law has an autonomous existence from the League in the way that it's difficult to envisage international organization of the interwar period without a connection to the League. Perhaps as a further caveat, international lawyers and certainly international law academics probably took some time to accommodate the emergence of this new international actor. If you're looking at textbooks from the early 20s, nothing of the sort that I've said so far. The idea that this was a revolution in international organization was reflected in the books. Oppenheim's 4th edition by Roxburgh makes passing references at best to the League. So it took international lawyers some time to internalize that something was perhaps underway. And the final point, third and last caveat, I think our fascination, to the extent that we shared, I'm not sure whether the plural is apposite here, but certainly my fascination with the international law of the 1920s, the international legal discourse of the 20s, is largely autonomous from the League. Kelsen is timeless in his attempt to work towards scientific precision. I mean, strange but timeless. The League doesn't necessarily enter. Lauterpacht is probably timeless, but Lauterpacht's well, I'm not sure whether Lauterpacht is as timeless as Kelsen, but that's a separate discussion for our sort of follow-up. But again, Lauterpacht's understanding of international law doesn't depend on there to be an international organization. If anything, the formative Lauterpacht works on private law sources and analogies proceed from a decentralized, non-institutionalized vision of international law. So there's a lot of international law that we can get excited about without mentioning the League. But the League did have a shaping influence, I would say, on international law once these caveats have been made and once we're sort of looking beyond that. We don't need to go as far as Martti Koskinen, who said that in 1919 international law was born for a second time. So you've got the late 19th century, 1873 birth, and then you've got the rebirth after the First World War. But I do think we can say the international legal order that came into being from 1990 onwards was significantly different from anything that had existed before and significantly similar to what we have today. So I do think there's a significant shaping influence. And I'll make three relatively quick points on that before winding up, which all go towards one general thrust, namely that with the League, we're beginning to think of international law in an era of international institutional organization. The first point goes to lawmaking. I would say that lawmaking in the League era and under the influence of the League became gradually more centralized. Not in any top-down manner of the sort of Security Council lawmaking in the anti-terrorism field or World Health regulations or ICAO secondary lawmaking, not that. Far more subtle or far more modestly. In the interwar period, under the aegis of the League, lawmaking was becoming centralized in cautious ways. The League became a relevant forum where states expressed views about the law. League debates prompted state responses. So you might still have state practice, but generated in a central forum. This practice would feed into treaty interpretation, custom formation, the usual processes, which didn't change outwardly, but the locus at which the relevant evidence was collected was becoming more central, or more of the evidence was collected in central multilateral sites. State reporting under League cooperative frameworks permitted a dialogue about the law, perhaps an understanding of law as process, something that was worked out in dialogue between states with a minimum of goodwill and an international supervisory body. Again, something that wasn't really so prominent before, but that today shapes any realistic vision of how law operates. Conferences organized under the auspices of the League or the League's subsidiary specialized organizations were conscious exercises in lawmaking by treaty drafting. Now that's not new. That existed before, but I would say with the League, codification began in earnest and systematically. Partly at the general League level, partly within the specialized agencies, or I'm using the not contemporaneous terminology here. Transport, aviation, shipping, etc. Now, a final point on this, still on lawmaking or the finding of the law. Cynics might say that bureaucrats in the League hijacked Wilson's ideas that there should be open covenants openly arrived at, and rather than as a clarion call against secret treaties, this ended up being the technical, sort of the archival dream of sort of treaty registration. Treaties would henceforth have to be registered. Nice and fine. So there's a creation of an international apparatus, in McNair's phrase, of treaty registration. Not quite sure that was the impulse for Wilson, but that's some fallout of that impulse against secret treaties. We do have, since the League's time, a treaty series. We have some, if you want, early day database. So with the League, I would say the lawmaking process begins to reach its curious transitional stage, where state consent remains relevant. On the outside, nothing really much changes, but state consent has to be assessed and given in settings that are dominated and within agendas that are shaped by international organizations, where concerted attempts at lawmaking almost inevitably involve international organizations, international institutions. I think we haven't left that transitional stage where consent matters, but the forms through which it is sought, given, obtained, or pressured onto states is curious and have little resemblance to what our naive visions of freely expressed consent mean. I think we're still in that transitional stage, and that transitional stage began with the League. A second, shorter point, and I think this is on firmer ground now, with the League era, we're beginning to enter the period where we think of international law as a law with courts. The PCIJ, which I've spoken about relatively little so far, happy to pursue this in discussions because it's a topic of great interest to me, wasn't set up within the League structure but linked to it in manifold ways. It was rather more modest than the courts that 19th century legalists had dreamt of as supreme arbiters of peace. This was a court on the sidelines of the peace and security machinery. And Ole Spiermann, who's written about the court in detail, is somewhat dismissive, but probably is right in saying it was no more than a footnote in the political history of the League of Nations. So miles away from the dreams of even early 20th century Hague Conference participants of what a court should do. But it was there, the court, perhaps on the margins, not a major dispute settler, but it did act. It dealt with cases. States appeared before the court rendered judgments and rendered advisory opinions. And in this process, this is again Ole Spiermann, international law moved from Buchrecht, law on the books, to practice, law practically applied. And I think there's an important follow-up. Now, we might be dismissive of the PCIJ's role as a dispute settler, but the process of thinking about international law changed. We had courts who would generate interpretations, or authoritative interpretations. In the process of dispute settlement, international law was given tangible meaning. You had an authoritative interpreter who would say what the law meant in a given context. Forget about inter partes validity or whether other states are bound. For once, there was a forum that would say what it means for an international law norm to be invoked. And that, I think, had a formative impact on our understanding of international law. An international law that works with authoritative interpreters rather in a purely decentralized way. It was only 10 years after the PCIJ was operational that Herr Schlauterpach published the development based, incidentally, a book based on Geneva lectures, the development of international law by the PCIJ. By the early 1930s or by the late 1920s, we were safely within the field of thinking about international law as a discipline in which courts exercise interpretative authority. They are agents of legal development. I think we cannot understand international law without that far more relevant role of courts today, which has supplemented or replaced the initial function that people had in mind when setting up courts as dispute settlers and arbiters of peace. But again, it began with the League. A final point. As the League began to work with law and as it began to codify law, international law branched out. So the branching out of the international organizational activities was married with a branching out of international law as a discipline. Josef Kunz, who was relatively skeptical about many things of the League, said that in all the dealings of the League, international law was at the heart of the discussion. And he said this sort of in the late 1940s and didn't find that particularly good about it. He thought there was far too much international law in the League. The point is sometimes oversold. I don't think we can understand the League only as a legalistic project. It was far more than that. But I do think there's a point to the observation that as the League engaged in ever broader fields of international relations, law went with it. So minority rights are an obvious example. nobody could have thought of minority rights in the mid-19th century as a sub-part of the discipline of international law. Mandate territories and the idea of a sacred trust. I'm not a fan of this. We don't need to be rosy-eyed about this, but this was new. This was a new field for international law. The League and its civil service began to see itself as the guardian of community interests that were making their way into international law. So you see a broadening, a branching out, a reorientation, and you see perhaps in a PCIJ judgment that was not so significant as a dispute settlement process in the Danzig Danzig case, you see the Permanent Court recognizing that there was nothing wrong or nothing impossible about international law recognizing direct rights of individuals. So you see a branching out, a reorientation, an opening up of international law in the League era and under the influence of the League. Now, did all of this add up to a second coming, if you want, a rebirth of international law? Perhaps the question of how we define that. Perhaps also as international lawyers where we have sort of incrementalism implanted in the DNA. Most of us, and me included, are cautious about second births and all this. But I do think there are a series of step changes that meant that the legal order of the interwar period was different from what had been before and very similar. And in many ways, was beginning to approach our contemporary vision of international law. So this would be my last point on the League's second legacy, the way it shaped international law. All this has been a bit eclectic. I think I'm sort of speaking for quite some time already. Perhaps in conclusion, rather than confronting you with a full third legacy, perhaps I'll end with a sort of a note on the third perspective. The idea, what did the League do to internationalism? And this is really sort of just a way of winding up the overall perspective, the collection of sort of sketches that I've offered to you. So, internationalism. Internationalism existed before the League. It may have had its heyday before the League, when in the 19th century people dreamed about how world governance should have to be set up. Pacifists, socialists, many other abolitionists had ideas about how the world should be reorganized. For much of the 19th century, these thoughts were very prominent, but they lacked a site, a forum, and an institution where they could be played out. You had your private gatherings, of course, but perhaps not much more. Now, the League didn't please everybody. Many thought it was a bit of a compromise solution. But it did offer a site for internationalist thinking. And I think it remained that. During the 1920s and relatively quickly, really from the beginning of the League, there was a projection of the League as a beacon of hope. That was, for once, the institution that internationalists could use to work towards ambitious goals. Didn't always work, but that was the idea. So Geneva in the 20s attracted fanatic do-gooders who would sign any petition left, right, center, freaks, utopians, but also pretty pragmatic, progressive, and conservative politicians who thought it was useful to work in these structures that had been created. And I think the mix is interesting. Now, there was always, in these mix of groups, a potential for hubris. And that was rightly criticized at the time. So the talk about Geneva men and occasionally Geneva women who had pipe dreams of how the world should be run and was completely in their sort of caught in their bubble, where there was not even remote connection to real life, who were sort of dreaming up fancy projects in the safe space of the League, and it was nowhere near, not approaching realism. One of the dreamers, Salvador de Madariaga, said, "The plop of the champagne cork was the artillery of the League." I mean, those lines are recipes for Trump and Brexit, for elite bashing. But of course, that is also a bit cheap to only focus on that, because for part of certainly for the first 15 years, the League was attracting not just the champagne corks and the fanatic do-gooders, but also the pragmatic politicians. The League of Nations Union in the UK had 500,000 members in 1933, at a time when Hitler was elected, and you might say we were safely downhill, on the way downhill. The League was a significant force for progress that had commanded enthusiasm of the predictable circles, but well beyond that. It was a space for a creative space, if you want, for progressive courses. And I think if I, in concluding, move slightly away from the initial title that I chose, rather than seeing it as one great experiment, where our response has always to be, it failed or it didn't really work, we should probably see the League of Nations of Geneva of the 1920s and 1930s as a laboratory for various experiments towards progress, some bizarre, some going nowhere, some a bit boring, some succeeding, some not so, some more dramatic than others. But I do think the League did, to internationalist thinking, it did offer a space, a site, a forum, an outlet. And I think that is perhaps the most significant legacy, that for once there was a room for progressive experiments. And I think the fact that this was actually a room that was popular and populated by many from different areas is perhaps the main cause why we should re-engage and reconnect with the League as it approaches the centenary, precisely at the time where we think of those causes being under threat, where we think we're only fighting rearguard actions for internationalism, where we're thinking of the international acquis as being something that has to be protected. I think precisely in those times, re-engaging with the League's history can be exciting, fruitful, and something we should all be engaging in. Thank you for your patience. I look forward to our discussion.